In today's world, you don't hear much about murders involving real vampires and vampire cults. However, this was the case in 1996, the year of Prince Charles and Diana's divorce, Bill Clinton's re-election, the first ever flip phone launched by Motorola, and the Macarena came out on top. A 16-year-old teenager from Kentucky founded a cult called the Vampire Clan. It started innocently with a role-playing game, but ended up darker than anyone could have imagined. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, the host, and thanks for joining. Now, I don't know if it's because we're smack in the middle of spooky season or what, but I've been getting such a large amount of emails and messages about story ideas for 10-Minute Murder that I can barely tread water on them. Just know that I will definitely read each and every one. I may not get a chance to respond completely or immediately, but I for sure am reading them all, so don't assume that I'm blowing you off or I don't like your idea. And I love that y'all are so into the podcast like I am and are eager to contribute. Someone told me that I should start a 10-minute murder discussion group, like on Facebook. But if I'm going to be honest, I don't really have time for anything else. I feel like the research and other things that I'm doing for the podcast would suffer, so I don't think I can take that on right now. But I will look into it, though. It's a cool idea. It may be something that I can set up and have several of you moderate. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud right now. Before we get going with the story today, this is your reminder to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. Links are in the show notes of this episode as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now, to the story. The vampire craze of the 90s had a strong impact on culture. It seemed like harmless fun for alternative kids, but this fascination ranged from sporting pale-faced powder and long black coats to dodgy rituals and blood tasting. Rod Farrell was born on March 28, 1980, in Murray, a small town in Callaway County, Kentucky. His parents got married and quickly divorced soon after his birth. He was raised without a father by an absent mother involved in drugs and prostitution and a manipulative grandmother. Rod kind of stood out in this small community. He had shoulder-length black hair, wore a long black trench coat, and bored anyone who was within earshot with his claims of being a 60,000-year-old demon, a 500-year-old vampire, or just Satan himself. The first chapter of this vampire wannabe story is a role-playing game called Vampire: The Masquerade. Contrary to many households, his mother didn't restrain her son from playing obscure games, but she introduced him to this game. In his book, Wicked Western Kentucky, Richard Parker described her as an evil figure. Rod's mother, Sandra, was arrested when police discovered a love letter she had written to a 14-year-old boy. Police charged her with solicitation to commit rape due to the sexual nature of the letter. This letter said, quote, "I long to be near you, to become a vampire, a part of the family immortal, and truly yours forever. You will then come for me and cross me over, and I will be your bride for eternity, and you my sire." And again, she wrote this to a 14-year-old boy. The game made him believe that he was indeed his game character in real life. Rod started exploring his newly found identity in the occult and Satanism, ultimately leading to a loss of touch with reality. Now, everyone knows at least one person who likes vampire movies or dresses up as a vampire for Halloween. And even when that TV show, what was it called? True Blood, it came on HBO, I watched that. I'm not ashamed to say that I read the Twilight books. But unfortunately, some disturbed teenagers are prone to tipping over the edge from fantasy to reality. They implemented what they saw in movies into life and started performing rituals and drinking each other's blood. Soon, driven by their role models created by Anne Rice in her best-selling books and satanic texts, they aimed to attack a human to move to a higher level in their real-life game. Rod, along with fellow vampire cult member Howard Anderson, entered the house of Richard Wendorf on November 25, 1996. They found Richard asleep on the couch. Rod decided to attack before he woke up to avoid any type of confrontation. You would assume that being an, air quotes, real vampire, Rod and Howard would just bite his neck. but instead they picked up a crowbar that they had found at the house. Rod Ferrell beat Richard to death, cracking his skull and ribs. The ongoing massacre in the living room was discovered by Richard's wife, Ruth, who had been taking a shower while Richard was being killed. When they saw her, she was attacked also by the vampire cultists with the same crowbar. According to Rod, he wasn't intending to hurt Ruth, but he murdered her in revenge because she splashed a cup of hot coffee on him. She was bludgeoned to death on the kitchen floor. Following the killings, Ferrell marked Richard's body with a V-shaped burn. The choice of victims was not accidental. The attacked couple were the parents of Rod's girlfriend, Heather. She seemed to change dramatically after she began dating him. Heather's parents banned her from speaking to him. She ran away from home, which she claimed to be hell, and that had motivated her boyfriend to act. Rod Charles Mansoned his friends and convinced them to raid Wendorf's house to set free his damsel in distress. Locals claimed that there had been warning signs before the tragedy. The underground cult was rumored to practice Satanism, animal abuse, and boozy parties at cemeteries and abandoned properties. The cult kept a low profile in their free-time activities under the police radar, though. The community of Murray started suspecting some type of cult activity going on after the cult mutilated 2 shelter dogs, and police were tipped off about a satanic cult operating in the town. After the vampire wannabes reached Florida, one of Rod's friends witnessed the cult members sucking each other's blood. He also claimed to have overheard an idea of stealing the Wendorf's Ford Explorer SUV after killing them for the subsequent trip. Real vampires would have turned into bats and flown away. Driven by the passion for Anne Rice's books, they took the depicted fantasy at their word. They planned to make a pilgrimage to the Jerusalem of vampires, New Orleans. The vampire movies were on the rise in the early 90s. Following Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992, the film version of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, came out 2 years later. And for those who aren't familiar with the movie or the book, the story takes place in New Orleans. Not only did they hope that they would meet other real vampires there, but they also hoped to find a voodoo practitioner who would give them supernatural powers. The criminal mastermind Rod Ferrell used Wendorf's stolen credit card to buy a knife in Walmart, serving himself up on the investigators' plate. When they arrived in New Orleans, they weren't able to follow through with their vampire plans, as they were on the run, living off of what they managed to find or steal. As the teenagers realized that they weren't rich landowners from colonial times, just like their hero, Vampire Lestat, and they were super broke, one of the cult members was desperate. Charity Kesey phoned her grandmother as they ran out of money. Thankfully, Charity's Nana thought better of it and gave the police a call and repeated all of the necessary information, including the group's whereabouts. Heather and Rod were tricked to meet at a local hotel where instead of Nana, they met the cops. After being held at a local jail for a week, they were extradited back to Florida. On February 12, 1998, then 17-year-old Ferrell, after changing his confessions several times, pleaded guilty to both murders. He testified that the rest of his vampire pack were innocent. Rod claimed that Anderson didn't participate in the killings, and he was only there as a wingman, whose job was to steal a credit card, jewelry, and the SUV. Rod's attorney's line of defense regarding his insanity was rejected, and Ferrell was sentenced to death. Charity Kesey and Dana Cooper were both convicted of 2 counts of third-degree murder, but Charity got a 10.5-year sentence, and Dana was given 17.5 years. Wingman Howard Anderson was convicted of the same charges as Ferrell and sentenced to life in prison. As always, when a convicted killer happens to be a game player of any kind, it provokes a whole lot of accusations and debates. The media had a field day, and parents pointed fingers at certain games and forbid their kids to play them. In the case of Rod Ferrell, he was a ticking time bomb, void of empathy and morality, ready to explode at any time. Role-playing and the vampire obsession was only a spark. Rod was an example of bad family, mental, and cultural conditioning. Instead of getting professional help, he turned to occultism, vampirism, and Satanism, which made him feel powerful and special. Small towns like Murray in western Kentucky were forever changed as people realized that true evil, previously associated with bigger cities, creeps in unnoticeably, even into their neighborhoods. The story shows how one disturbed individual can go so far as to influence others to drink each other's blood and escalate to murder. The teens truly believed that they could transform into vampires and get away with anything, just like in their favorite books. Instead, they hit a solid, reality-based brick wall, and justice was served.